Welcome back to another episode of Thinking Critically. So today is going to be a bit different where we have all of the members of the intelligence speculation team. So we have Garrett, we have Gaurav, and we have Pat and myself. And we're going to discuss outrage culture. What exactly it is, maybe talk about a few examples and the pros and cons of it. So to get started, what we are going to do is we are just going to ask the question, what exactly is outrage culture?
So outrage culture, to me, is this tendency for people to have an emotional response to things that can be mundane, that shouldn't require an emotional response, or just other general things. So, for example, why is there a warning for peanut butter on a peanut butter jar? Why can't people use common sense? That might elicit an emotional response from somebody. And then the second thing is when outrage is used against us. So our emotions, when we have an emotional response to things, that usually will draw our attention to something and it will bypass our reasoning. So media knows that this is something that happens and they use it against us. And that's called outrage porn, where the media will present things in such a way as to produce outrage, and therefore we would form conclusions prematurely or without full thought or without all of the information that would be involved or that should be involved in processing. So
if you were to, I guess, from what I'm hearing from you, Garrett, so outrage culture in and of itself is just kind of the emotional response, I guess.
Mhm.
And then there is the outrage, I guess we would classify it as outrage porn, which is where this emotional response where, that you get from whatever it is that you're focusing on is then kind of hijacked and weaponized to a degree by the media or whomever has some sort of plan for that particular piece of material that's causing this large emotional response in people. I don't know, that's kind of what I've got from all that.
that's essentially my understanding. The outrage culture is more of a psychological, personal phenomenon, and then the outrage porn industry is when that's used against us on a mass scale. So Um, and yeah, I guess one example would be just with the protests going on, right? So when the George Floyd protests started, there was the term the umbrella man who was at the AutoZone bashing windows. So that immediately elicited emotional responses from especially the people who are opposed to the protesters, saying that, all these protesters are out, they want to riot, they want free things. And as it turns out, they've identified, or they believe they've identified that man as a member of a white supremacist group who was out there essentially trying to create that impression, to create that emotional response by being viewed in that way. So that's one example of where the outrage culture would come in, where we're seeing it. Actually, it's both. The outrage culture is we're seeing it and we're getting mad. And then the outrage porn is that he did it, and he did it with a purpose to make people outraged. So
it seems like to me that there's a physiological and psychological phenomenon. I mean, I'm a biologist, so I'm going to look at it like this, but that's then being exploited, and it's manifesting in society in a certain way, and then powers or organizations like media outlets have understood that phenomenon and are able to exploit it. The phenomenon, of course, being if you read a book or consumed any form of media and your heart rate stayed completely baseline and you didn't have a surge of neurotransmitter release, either making you feel really sad or really happy or feel something, if you didn't elicit an emotional response, a lot of people aren't going to consume some media and solely do it for the emotion or for the intelligent or cognitively speculating the material. It's to elicit an emotional response. Even if that's a negative response, it's something that we're tied to. It's why people are tied to stress, why people are tied to anger. It's better than nothing, basically. It's way better than nothing. Actually, the media has found it, and clickbait and social media obviously have capitalized the system of outrage, because it keeps getting us these hits of dopamine and giving us this physiological response, even if it's a stress response. I argue that it's something that people are in our society becoming more and more addicted to, and so that's being capitalized on by the media, where it's like, look, it's really easy when there's a really tense situation, you know, to do something like what the Umbrella Man did, and manipulate that situation and get the coverage and be able to take the narrative, you know. And we can see in today's society, people can look at two people can look at the exact same events unfold and have two completely different narratives. Two people can walk away from hearing and both of them think it was a success. The Democrats like, we fucking got him, and the Republicans are like, we're exonerated, you know. And it's like, okay. so it's about, I think that's what this is kind of a bigger testament to, is like, we're humans, and we become really reactionary, like we talked about. We react to stimuli and stimulus. We don't think about maybe our reactions, you know. And the media and outrage culture is just a byproduct of that, of how, you know, people realize it's an easy way to tap in, to get our attention and feed off our energy, essentially. And so in that way, I guess I framed it to be a pretty negative thing, you know, because it's becoming more and more unconscious. We're not deciding where to focus our energy, you know, and we can only change so many things at once. If we're going to flip out about some famous person's kid that got into college because he paid a bunch of money, or the aunt thing, you know, who sued her 12-year-old cousin, which wasn't even the story that John Oliver talked about, we're burning that currency that we have, that social currency. Like, we can make a difference if we all, you know, unite and put our energy behind a few things that matter, like the environment or who's leading our country. But if we fucking flip out about everything all the time, then it's not, you know, we start to burn that.
Yeah, I think I think that it's the emotions, right? You were going back to that, and we are very emotional beings, and we can.
It's undeniable.
What's that?
That's undeniable. We are
Yeah.
emotional beings. We can't deny that. That's okay.
But
So
I mean, we're sort of, you know, I don't want to say simplifying the conversation, because, you know, the conversation is just starting and whatnot. But this isn't something that we should view as being done to us by, you know, media or, you know, whatever powers may be, politicians or whatever the situation is. Outrage culture has become so pervasive in the age of social media, you know, where we're limited to 140 characters, or we're designing posts that are going to get the most shares or going to get the most likes. We've identified, whether this is consciously or subconsciously, certain buzzwords that are going to evoke emotions in people. And, you know, that is really what it fundamentally comes down to, like Garrett and Grav were saying, you know, evoking that psychological emotion or that psychological response. And we've realized, you know, as humans, and this is across all political spectrums, across the world, across, you know, geographic regions, religions, cultures, we've realized that we can elicit these psychological responses by hitting those certain buzzwords. So when we're writing out our tweets, you know, we're very unlikely to say, you know, something like, you know, 600,000 abortions were performed last year. That's just not that's just a fact. That's not something that's eliciting an emotional response. But when you're like 600,000 unborn babies murdered by unwanting mothers, or something along those lines, like, that's something that elicits an emotional response. I mean, you've got murder, unborn babies, like all those sorts of things. But it's just something that even distills down to our conversations that we have in our everyday lives. So we've stopped listening to each other. We've stopped having constructive conversations. And whether that's on the left or it's on the right, if you're on the left, you're going to say, oh, those people are ignorant, when they come with, you know, right-leaning political views. If they're on the right, they're going to say, oh, those people are naive, or they're snowflakes, or they're sheep, or whatever it may be. And it's completely stifled all civil discourse, and all discourse that would lead to us coming to some sort of agreement on how to move forward. And that does, like, distill back to politics at a higher level. That's why we're so gridlocked across the nation, because we become so entrenched and so emotionally resistant to any sort of other opinions that we'd rather be outraged than listen to what anybody has to say. So I guess my whole point is, this isn't something that just happens in the media. This just isn't something that happens in the government or among politicians. This happens in how we interact with each other on a day-to-day basis, whether it be in social media or in person. And it's so pervasive right now that it really, demands that we go back, we discuss it, and we reevaluate how we're looking at certain situations. Because like Rob said, it's very easy to become outraged, very, very easy to elicit an emotional response and, have that lead to some sort of action. It's very difficult to sit back, think critically, take in all the evidence, and then sort of go forward with a well-developed opinion.
Yeah, people have definitely gotten lazy. I would call it lazy thinking, and just letting the emotions get the best of them. It seems like, and it has. I think that the social media platforms have unfortunately exacerbated this. I mean, I think it was always a problem, as you have said, Pat. We are just emotional beings, right? In general, the emotion centers of our mind can easily hijack our higher order thinking very easily if we're not careful. And
Yeah.
then once our higher order thinking is hijacked by the emotional centers of our mind, it's just game over unless you know how to properly mitigate it.
If I would reframe that. I would say if there isn't coherence and alignment between your emotions, I don't think emotions are fundamentally negative things at all. I don't think that they're just there to detract from our ability to think critically. Like I think they can definitely be used to guide us. Like certain thoughts feel good. This is a whole other conversation. Other thoughts don't feel good, and it's like it's okay to use our emotions in like a conducive way. But of course, when there's not that coherence and there's not that alignment, like we have both, right? We have our emotions and we have our brain. If you want to think of our heart and our brain, like if you can think of juxtaposing them together, then we can come up with more comprehensive solutions to things. If we're compassionate and we're thinking about like, well, what's best, because as Patrick talked about, this is the way we interact with people on a daily basis, and we didn't get here overnight. And another big thing I want to think about is like John Oliver's bit about bad science, like it's way more catchy to write a headline saying smelling farts cures cancer when that kills cancer cells, when that was a ridiculous headline. The actual bit was from a study that said certain sulfur compounds have shown novel promise in the treatment. It probably meant like using sulfur in vitro, like it was so far removed. So this was a headline from the 70s, and it hasn't gotten much better. Scientific reporting and scientific journalism and the state it's gotten to is why we're all doing what we're doing, because it's so fucked, right? It's so bad. It's in such a terrible state, and people use data and science as a way to manipulate public opinion, and it's ridiculous. Or we should have a panel on hydroxychloroquine soon. That'll be interesting.
Well, I mean, to go back to your emotions comment, what I was saying is, I mean, I don't think emotions are fundamentally bad or good, but it is a part of who we are, right?
Right.
And we have to be aware that our best decisions comes from our higher mind, right? So the neocortex. That's not the emotional center of our brain, and that is what we need to engage if we want to make good logical choices. So if the emotions are riled up, whether it be, I'm angry or on the good end of the spectrum, maybe, I'm aroused, whatever, or I'm jubilous, I'm excited about something, you're not going to be using the parts of your mind that are best suited
Here's
for rational decision making. So that's, I mean, I suppose that's what I mean by you have to watch out for emotions
John,
hijack.
And I totally get that point. And I don't, and this is the current situation that we're in has definitely evolved over the last few decades. And I do think that you have the 24-hour news cycle, social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all that stuff to blame for the contribution to this outrage type of culture. Because before, you got a newspaper once a day and that's where you got your news, and you read an article, you can distill that information and come to some sort of informed opinion about it. But if you go on Twitter and you see a trending hashtag and you just read tweet after tweet after tweet after tweet after tweet that is all towards the same thing, towards the eliciting some sort of emotional response, you very quickly become overwhelmed, because there's no delineation from the time when you make your emotional response to when you can make some sort of logical, informed response to it. Because you're in the world that we live in today, the dominating news cycle or the trending hashtag or the thing that's got the most shares on Facebook is the thing that you see over and over and over again.
Well, maybe maybe it's a time thing too. Maybe people just don't have enough time, because you get, when you think about it, when you get when your emotions get riled up, or whether it be good or bad, usually before you are able to get back to baseline, it takes time, right? You have to kind of step away, and you have to give yourself some time to think about the situation. So if you're constantly being bombarded with outrageous headlines from all different aspects of social media or wherever you get your news, and you're constantly looking at it, I don't know if you'd ever have a time to get out of that excited state, to actually begin to make better decision. Well, I mean, be able to have access to your higher mind, because the emotions would be so riled up.
Well, moreover,
so
it takes
engaged.
time. It takes time to get all the information and all the facts, and we're already so predisposed to coming to conclusions immediately and then sticking to those conclusions because we never want to believe that the conclusions that we had are wrong. So that immediately makes reevaluation impossible for most people. So we're evaluating the information that we first received, and that information is always incomplete, very far from the truth, and always presented in a way that is meant to elicit an emotional response. And the people that you follow on Twitter, the people you follow on Instagram, are going to present these things in drastically different ways. And in all of our social media, we've created echo chambers for ourselves, right? So we are very likely to follow people who agree with us, who share the same opinions. And this is true whether or not you're on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. You're very unlikely to be getting sort of different perspectives from multiple people from which you can ultimately draw conclusions. So when you've built that echo chamber where any thought that you put out there is going to immediately be accepted and sort of echoed, you do have some sort of lack of accountability when you're posting, but when you're receiving that information, also, you're receiving that same tidbit of information presented in the same way from 100 different people. So you're very unlikely to ever arrive at a conclusion that isn't that conclusion that's been presented to you. And I do think that part of it is laziness, like you mentioned before. People aren't going to go out and they aren't going to research other sources. And then the other part of it is people actually believe that they're informed. People actually believe that they're getting all of the information because they think that, they're reading, they think that they're, looking at all these different tweets, they think they're hearing opinions from different people. But when the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, right? Like 50-50. If you're 85 to one side, you're never going to get those like mediating 35% of the opinion that'll bring you sort of
I don't think anyone's ever going to be a perfect 50-50. I mean, it's going to be, as long as you remain somewhere in the realm of reason, right?
100%. But yeah. I'm not saying, I'm just saying that 100% or 85% of their information all comes from, one side, and then 10% will be from more moderate of that side, and then only 5% probably is actually presenting some sort of antithetical type of information that's not already coming in and supporting previously held hypotheses. So we're all subject to this confirmation bias, where we all go out, develop opinions in our heads, and then we sort of look for the sources that are going to back up our opinions. But then also we're emotional beings who form an emotional response, and we sort of live in this culture where it's very in vogue right now to socially drag people across the coals if they've said something or done something, and we don't have all the information, but we see oh, this person did this 10 years ago or whatever. We don't know the context, we have no idea what's going on, but we form that emotional response, and we say, oh, wow, those people, we're writing them off. We're canceling them to sort of bring in cancel culture. So somebody does something wrong and it's just immediately, we've written them off regardless of the context, regardless of the other information. And, that's where we are right now.
I think going back to your tweet example you gave a while ago about, unwanting mothers murder 6,000 babies, right? So something like that, it does two things. And I think the outrage culture, the word culture really fits well, because when you put something like that out into the void of social media, the first thing it does is it draws all the people who agree with you. Some dissent, right? But you get all these people who agree with you pulling into one place, and it becomes this self-reaffirming thing.
Validation. Yeah.
It's validating. You know, people are saying, yeah, I agree with this. This makes me mad too, whatever. The second thing it does is it's a trap for anybody who would try to dissent. So you use the loaded language, and it's like a thought terminating cliche fallacy. So you use the murder, murder 6,000 babies, and then somebody comes in there saying, well, they're pro-choice or whatever, and now you've trapped them, so you can say, oh, so you just support murder, right? So you've loaded the deck to not have a discussion about it. You've just terminated it. You don't want a nuanced discussion. You just put these morally powerful words in there to prevent that.
Yeah, because the moment somebody with a dissenting opinion comments on that post, they get dragged, right, by everybody else. They pile on by the echo chamber that you've established. So anybody comes on with a different sort of point of view, they're immediately going to be told they're a fool, they're ignorant, they're not well educated, like any of these sorts of things, which again is a emotional sort of attack that you're bringing on that person, because you're not attacking, necessarily their point of view, you're attacking who they are as a person, which again sort of brings us very far away from where we should be, which is a civil discourse where we can have a conversation about the differing opinions that we have, sort of discount certain things, agree on others, and move forward to just, I'm entrenched in my position, you're entrenched in yours. If you don't agree with me, you're a fool, you're ignorant, you're, this, that, and the other. Yeah.
I mean, from a more physiological point of view, so that's how I'm going to look at this. I think the laziness thing is a big, I think it unlocks a lot of understanding into this, okay? Because I got to this conclusion because I wanted to disagree with you, John, when you said you can't be in a state of intense emotion and make a logical decision, because now it's been close to 100 days where I've consciously taken time out to meditate, if not just once, several times a day. And so I think the delineation comes from unconscious emotion versus consciously guiding your emotion. Now the latter being, imagine being really upset or or having health issues and having pain or something, and then trying to guide through your thoughts and through your irrational mind yourself to a place of feeling gratitude, of feeling like really grateful and really happy and really euphoric. I've gotten to those places before, and I've been able to figure out things in my life feeling that way. And I think a lot of people would be like, okay, you could probably make a rational, decision, perhaps even a good decision for your life in those moments of extreme euphoria, sober, meditating, right? But that's different because I don't just sit down and reach that place. I deliberately get there. And over the last, doing it every single day, I've gotten better at it. And I argue if people did that and were more emotional, and we're like, oh, I'm going to use my thoughts, like what am I grateful for, what are people I love, whatever, to reach a place of gratitude, then we could use our emotions. But the opposite of this is what we're seeing. The opposite of those emotions, those higher vibration emotions, are visceral anger, jealousy, hatred, and that's really easy to tap into. It's lazy. It's lazy because it's harder to get people to be conscious and to have an elevated conversation, that maybe has a more colorful gradient of emotions, maybe some compassion and gratitude, but maybe some heat and tension as well, because that's part of the human experience. But it's not about that. With this type of content, this type of media, it's all about immediately devolving to the lowest common denominator, and how can we stoke the most emotion and the most anger and get the most people. And that's lazy. That's lazy capitalism. That's lazy marketing. That's lazy communication, and that's a disservice to mankind and everybody. So I think that's the two things.
Yeah, I think, well, with the distinction there between, talking about emotions and, guided emotions, it's not you just being outraged and being overcome by your emotions, but
right,
you trying to work through your emotions, trying to understand them. So when you're with that process of working through and trying to understand your emotions, that's not you being overcome by the limbic system in your mind. That's you engaging your limbic system with your higher mind, in my opinion.
True. I guess I
Yeah.
was just gonna say I still feel intense emotion at times though,
Yeah.
but they're positive.
But your ability to concentrate on them, to understand them, to work through them, that takes time. That's not just you.
Right. It's
yeah,
not
that's not what we're talking about, I guess.
Right.
That's a
No,
different scenario.
But
our
I think
default,
making that distinction helps explain what helps
Yeah.
explain the topic overall. Is that it's become lazy and it's become a way to just tap into that biological mechanism, that fight or flight. That's not tapping into our higher consciousness and having an elevated discussion. It's tapping into something that we just know will give. It's instant gratification. That's the term I'm trying to use, and that's bad. So that's my argument. Right?
Okay.
I just think that so much of our thought processes have become mechanized, and that's definitely to our detriment. But it's just like A elicits response B, which elicits action C, and that's just sort of where we are right now. We've developed that sort of codified response to the actions that we have, which is like we've said before, sort of antithetical to any sort of discourse that we could have. And it's just like when you have that response and your immediate response is anger, that brings about the real death of empathy, or being able to understand where other people are coming from, understanding other people's experiences, understanding other people's lives, and ultimately trying to figure out how we can sort of move forward. And with the death of empathy, I think ultimately comes also the death of civility, which is sort of like its next door neighbor. And that's why you ultimately see a simple Facebook post or a meme or something like that devolving into sort of this rabid shouting match between two different sides. It's because we have no empathy for other people, and when we have no empathy, we have no civility.
Yeah, the online discourses, and I've engaged in a number of them, and it's shocking how quickly people just will go off the rails sometimes. It depends on the person. It depends on the topic. I mean, I've had a number of wonderful conversations too, but I mean, it's really, really unfortunate. The civility has just kind of gone out the window. And, you're talking about these echo chambers and then just getting dragged through the coals earlier, Pat, if you have a dissenting view. I mean, an example for me comes to mind where I'm a big fan of Joe Rogan. I love his show, the Joe Rogan Experience. I think it's a fantastic podcast. And he had on the creator of the ocean plastic cleanup. He created something. I can't remember his name. He has a really unusual name, or actually unusual means different. But he had created this system that cleans up plastic in the ocean. And he had him on the podcast. And there was a post on Facebook about it. And then all in the comments, I see people disparaging Greta Thunberg and the work that she was doing to try to bring awareness to global warming, and then praising this young man, saying, well, he's going out there and he's doing something and actually making a difference in the world. He created something. And my argument was, he's addressing plastic in the ocean, Greta Thunberg's addressing global warming. These are separate issues.
Right.
There's no reason why you can't work on these simultaneously. They're both very important environmental issues. And because as far as what Greta she hasn't created anything, but she's helping to bring awareness to it, because the biggest change needs to come on a systemic, like governmental level. So only through governmental change will we begin to really make an impact on global warming. It's not anything that she can like go out and personally create herself. We have a number of wonderful technologies already. But anyway, I was just trying to make this delineation. I was saying, hey, you're getting it all wrong. It's really disheartening. And I just got shredded. I got blasted. I had people direct messaging me, calling me all sorts of names. It was really, really disheartening. And all I was trying to do was to say, hey, you really shouldn't be so harsh on Greta. She's bringing light to a completely separate issue. That was it.
Well, you bring up a great point, and that's the point of false equivalencies, right? So it's Greta has been, dragged over the coals, by all the right-wing media outlets, right-wing politicians, up from, the Trump administration, all the way down. So you have that one side of it, and then you say, in the similar, same breath, like, oh, environment. Then it's like everybody's already got such a negative opinion of Greta that they go out and they say, oh, I'm going to use this other piece of information to justify why Greta is bad and other people are good. And this happens all the time. So I imagine that there's also, underlying issues of sexism, ageism, like all those other sorts of things as well. Nativism and ethnocentrism and like all these other sorts of things, why people hate Greta.
All these isms, yeah.
All the isms. But there's definitely like, oh, I got this underlying baseline hate for this person, and I'm going to use this other piece of information to justify why I hate them and, sort of support these other people instead.
Oh, it's ripe with logical fallacies, for sure.
100%.
This phenomenon, there's so many. It might span the majority of them, in fact. But I think it speaks to something larger too. Like, this is something I think about sometimes. Like, at what point in our education or in the way people are being brought up, are we not taught to like be okay with being wrong? I guess is like a really interesting thing. I guess like when did that happen? Like when was it so bad for you to be wrong about something, when that's so human?
Testing. Maybe testing is what did it, because we just put an emphasis on being right on the tests. And
for what? What testing in general?
Like testing, growing up, like standardized testing. I mean, it's all about testing.
For sure, standardized testing is a huge disservice and one of the worst elements of the public education system. I tutor kids in standardized testing all the time, and the first thing I always tell them is it's nothing to do with anything except your ability to take this test. It doesn't speak to any other part of your character, your ability to do anything.
It's got to be bigger than that, though. Like, there's got to be some sort of fundamental cultural resistance to being wrong. Like, I don't think it's just like, I don't think that there's
no.
I'm not saying, I wasn't saying that standardized testing is the silver bullet and we fixed that. I mean, I'm sure it's probably multifaceted, but
I get it, but it's just like, I don't think that we can arrive at a conclusion on that, but there's got to be some other sort of situation.
If I had to
Be
guess,
like an interesting study.
it probably goes all the way back to the Greeks or earlier with the sophists. As soon as you're charging money for information, you have to make sure that you're at least giving information that's not going to be corrected, because then you're on the line for the money you've earned teaching somebody. So that's kind of my guess.
I think it's probably deeper than that too. I think it probably has some evolutionary basis, just because people have become so attached to what makes us different from each other. Like there's no biological basis for race. Literally,
nope.
There is no genetic. It's not like there's this range of genes or profile that's like for a black person, and then it changes as you move across the globe, right? But so that's just one really stark example of how we use these constructs to separate ourselves from each other. And then so when we feel that separation, we need to validate that. And then so we've been using more and more examples, increasingly absurd, from everyday life to validate that since I'm different from you, now I must be better than you in these ways. So I must be more right than you. And then we become to feel really defensive. And it's like, no, dude, just because I don't hold the same view as you doesn't mean I'm trying to attack your fundamental character. It's like,
so is it then a power dynamic, which I think is, an interesting perspective. So is it, we must be more right than wrong in order to attain the most power? And because I think that that's something that's sort of undeniable in society, is the ultimate goal of every individual, power, wealth, other that sort of stuff.
As a scientist, the one thing I learned is like whatever I believe today could be disproven 10 years from now. Like obviously there's a gradient of like how sturdy some data is compared to other data, for sure. Like gravity's pretty reliable. Like, you know, I'm pretty sure if I drop my phone tomorrow, it's still gonna fall. You know.
Well, there's one thing that's certainly indisputable, and that's that outrage and all of the other, subsequent things that we've talked about are definitely antithetical to the scientific method. There's no sort of evaluation, there's no hypothesis testing, there's no experimentation, there's no willingness to look at other facts. It is
judgment.
Yeah, it is at its very fundamental core a judgment call that is, sort of the exact opposite of what you would hope to see in any sort of scientific measure. So yeah, that's definitely very, very true.
So one thing I wanted to say real quick, because I was thinking further about why it's so hard for people to be wrong, and what exactly are the origins. It's probably multifaceted. The answer to that may actually be evolutionary, because of I'm sure you're all familiar with the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance, which is the uneasiness that you feel whenever you have your belief systems challenged, because humans really, really want to be consistent. And that is something that we all feel on like a primal level. That is something that is instinctual. It's obviously something that you can work through, because once you're aware of it, then you can figure out when it's getting the best of you. But being right is probably, it might be evolutionary. That strong desire to be correct all the time,
and to be accepted.
maybe it has. I mean, if it's evolutionary, that means that there's some sort of advantage to it, right? But obviously, it has disadvantages in today's modern society, and that it's a disservice if you don't recognize this and admit that it's okay to be wrong, because you can't be right all the time. I mean, you want to try to be as correct as possible, but it's okay to be wrong, and you have to update it based off of new information. But as far as the origins of it, I mean, it may be just a fundamental aspect of human nature.
I think the book Sapiens talks about, just this leap in evolution we've made, and how we have a lot of physiological, psychological, evolutionary framework that hasn't been able to update at the pace we've evolved, So it's like, you need to be right when you're like, hey, there's a mountain lion over there. So if you're going to go over there to go hunting, watch the fuck out, or you're going to get eaten. Like, that's really beneficial, because then someone dies if you're wrong, and then that has huge implications for your tribe, and it's just a mess, right? But it's like, now we're judging, we're making snap judgments on really, especially when it comes to videos, okay? It's like the first 5 seconds comes out and there's a whole public wave of opinion, and then it's almost like it's planned that way. It's like, then the next 10 seconds comes out, and then it's a whole nother, and then the whole minute video is released, and it's like, well, we've already been judged, jury, and executioner 1,000 different times, from the first moment we saw the first clip, or the first little bit of information was out there. And this goes even further into weaponized disinformation. Weaponized disinformation, campaigns. It's like, they know they're going to elicit an emotional response for you. And I mean, come on, you can swing elections this way. You can. It's got immense power, and people don't realize that. And I think that's, if anything gets taken away from this conversation, I hope it's that. It's like, I hope people are like, oh, like the way I react to something, especially on, like, when it comes to social media, and then how that affects your perception of things, like that holds some power. I think people just feel like maybe just disenfranchised, disempowered, and they just like let their energy just run chaotically, and like they're not mindful about things, and things like social media and stuff really feed into that, like Patrick brought up a good point. You had a newspaper once a day. Now it's like you can read 1,000 newspapers just scrolling through your phone, and you don't even open the articles. You just read the headlines, and then you have an emotional reaction about the headline, and you move on to the next headline. It's like, what kind of way is that to consume information? Your brain wasn't created to consume information that way. It's chaos. And so, it's. I think this is an example of that. This is an example of that dissonance. From the fact that we haven't updated our software and our programming to match the reality that we've kind of created for ourselves and society we've built, So when we have examples of phenomena like outrage culture, and it's an example of us regressing to that animal-like instinct in the context of current situation, and it creates a lot of dissonance, which is why we're having this conversation. It creates kind of chaos,
I think that there's got to be, something about, I think that, so I have 2 points. I think that one, you want to be right because you want to be accepted, right? You want to maintain the opinions of your tribe or your faction or your echo chamber or whatever it may be, because to have a divergent opinion ultimately means exile from that group, right? And then you've got to start over. So I think that that's a survival evolutionary mechanism right there. And then my second point is, I think that people are ultimately get very apathetic and get very comfortable with the status quo. Digesting new ideas, new information is, very difficult and challenging, not just, in its level of difficulty, but challenging to your fundamental core beliefs that you've probably held for your entire life. And your parents held before you and their parents held before them. But when we were, challenging, the Earth is the center of the universe, the geocentric theory, and moving to the heliocentric theory, Galileo was exiled. He had, solid science, but, nobody wanted to listen to it. And the church ultimately did not want to have their, ideas challenged. And, you see that, throughout history by all of the institutions that are in power. And that sort of relates back to, the maintenance of power and achieving power or attaining power. The people who have it want to stay in it, right? So they're going to do whatever they have to do to maintain that power. And ultimately that leads to a disregard or a, deliberate sort of manipulation of fact and reason. So their paradigm or their status quo isn't going to be shifted into something that's new. So I think that can't be discounted either.
Yeah, I think you made a great point about humans wanting to just fit in. That is a very, very strong thing that all people want to do, is to fit in with a group. Because, from a survival standpoint and just from just a mental health standpoint, from an evolution as well. Yeah, I mean, you want to fit in, right? I mean, and it's important to belong. So in order to just kind of keep the peace within the group, so to speak, you identify with the group, right? And then you kind of adopt the group's norms, the philosophies, the ethos, or whatever you want to call it, of the group. And then if you, as you said, Pat, all of a sudden you are challenging group norms, that can be very, very bad for you as an individual. You could be ousted, and then if you're forced to survive on your own, I'm not talking about in today's society, but let's say in the past, you're forced to survive on your own, that could lead to death, right? Because, trying to survive in prehistoric time with just by yourself outside of your group, that could be very bad for you. So that's a really, really interesting point.
But even today, it's not, maybe literal death, but I mean, you cannot discount the emotional impact that isolation or exclusion from a group would have on an individual. And it might not,
of
like
course,
I said, isn't going to lead to literal death, but emotional stunting, mental health issues, depression, all that sort of stuff.
Certainly in the immediate, until they were able to work through it. And hopefully it wasn't so bad. I mean, for some people, they take their own lives, which is awful. So it's quite literally when they are shunned from their groups or certain aspects of society, and they feel so despondent that there's no way out, that they take their own life. I mean, that's awful. But yeah, definitely with the that still happens.
Yeah. And with the rapidity that social media moves at nowadays, I mean, you make one mistake or you make one errant comment or something along those lines that gets taken out of context, gets posted about, and all of a sudden you get dragged. And then all of a sudden you're trending, and then all of a sudden, things are getting blown way out of proportion in a way that you never intended them to. I mean, so it seems like you've even got to be on guard about everything that you say at all points in time. It's like, what if I made a comment in this podcast that, was taken or misinterpreted like different or in a bad way? All of a sudden the podcast has gone viral, intelligent speculation has gone viral. They're, nitpicking everything else that we say for like more information. And then, it just gets posted about and, constantly talked about. And I can't even imagine the impact that that would have on an individual nowadays, like being the subject of that rage, of that, outrage culture, like seems like it would be a very overwhelming prospect.
Sounds terrible. It sounds
Yeah.
it sounds like a really, really unpleasant experience.
And
But
we've
of
all
course,
experienced it
yeah.
at some level, like you said with the Joe Rogan podcast. It's like I'm off Facebook now, literally off Facebook, because I can't handle all of the nonsense, all of the day-to-day just outrage that you see, from everybody, whether it's, friends or family members or, other people that or acquaintances. It's like, oh my God, how does that person believe this? It's like that I become enraged. I'm not susceptible and I'm certainly not perfect. And, I'm suddenly sitting there like, how do I possibly separate the person who can post something like this from the person that I know? And how can we go on and proceed to continue to have that sort of relationship? It becomes very, very difficult to do, right? To separate the words of somebody on social media or the things that they post or the articles that they share, and separating that from the person that you know them to be can be very difficult.
People draw there's huge character assassinations made, just depending on your political beliefs. I mean, just come out right and say it. Like if someone says in today's day and age, if they believe in Trump, for example, like that's enough to get people fired from their jobs. Like if that's not, like that wasn't the case during the Bush administration. That wasn't the case during any other administration in my lifetime. You couldn't just be like, and is there a risk in me just saying this? Yeah, because this is the world we live in, but if people aren't going to have the courage to have fucking discourse, then like that's the greatest disservice to humanity. Like we were put on this earth with the ability to speak to each other, and it's a really novel thing. I feel like it's a really human thing to have like a debate about something and to exchange views and to like for people to accept new premises and dissolve old constructs. I think that's really what makes us different from the beasts. It's like we can do that. We have that capacity of consciousness, and the fact that that's being threatened and people are not going to be as willing to engage in discourse at all because it's like, oh, I have all these things to lose. Like, is that freedom of speech? If there's a cost to your speech, is it still free speech? But then the other side of it becomes, well, free speech is clearly being blatantly abused, and people are just posting whatever the fuck, to elicit an emotional response. So like everything in life, it's a really complicated balance, but I think the greater threat to freedom of speech is maybe a worthy discussion to have.
Yeah, no, there's definitely nuance there, right? And it's interesting with outrage culture, where exactly do you draw the line?
Right.
Because you're going to get things across the spectrum, and there are absolutely legitimate reasons for people to push back and be outraged, right?
Right.
I mean, if somebody does something completely ridiculous off the wall, society shouldn't tolerate it, particularly somebody in power, and then they should be pushed back against to some degree. Now, I don't think that they should be completely publicly humiliated. Some of the degrees to what has happened to individuals in our society, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but there should definitely be a pushback, and it shouldn't be, I wouldn't say it shouldn't be tolerated, but then the outrage is definitely justified in my opinion. So it's difficult, right? You don't want to just get outraged at everything just because it's fashionable and it's something to do. It makes you feel good and works up the emotions and whatnot. But then there are legitimate reasons where you should actually be like, okay, well, I need to take a stand. I should probably say something because this is really ridiculous, and society should do something about this.
But there's a clear delineation, right? So like there are situations in when you should be justifiably upset and express that opinion, but is there ever a situation where you hear the headline news blurb in 140 characters and see that retweeted over and over again, that you should immediately jump to a conclusion about that situation. And I
We
would
should never
argue,
do that with any situation. We should
I would
never
argue
jump-
that
yeah,
it's no, right? Like
yeah,
you still
never.
have this, you still have an obligation to take in all of the available information and arrive ultimately at a conclusion. And so that's what differentiates, I think, outrage culture from, you know, being justifiably upset or being outraged or holding somebody accountable, right? So outrage culture, I think there is this implicit, like, instantaneous gratification that you get from, you know, your outrage, but you need to separate that from a well thought out, you know, sort of perspective that you develop after taking in all of the available information. And at that point, then yes, you should express your opinion. And I think that this has sort of been the amazing thing and the terrible thing about social media, is that we have greater access to everybody at, you know, the as fast as we can type on our keyboard, you know, and we can hear all these different opinions, and it's an excellent mechanism to actually hold people accountable, because you can distribute all of the things that that person has done, like an error. Yeah, but also, you know, we're incredibly susceptible to arriving at errant judgments based on limited information. So I guess that's, you know, my point about it is, there are situations in which you should be outraged, but you should never arrive at that conclusion based on that initial emotional response.
To be informed, basically,
Be
is what you're
informed.
saying. Is be informed is the delineating factor between being caught up in outrage culture versus being legitimately outraged over something.
Exactly. Mhm.
Okay.
Exactly.
I'd say that's fair. Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to obviously thinking critically or critical thinking in general, one thing I would say definitely about, you know, any of this outrage culture, and if you find yourself being swept up by it, which is very easy to do. I mean, we're all guilty of it. You know, all of us here, I've been guilty of it. I'm sure that you three have as well. And, you know, you see it on a daily basis, is that to just stop and think, right? I mean, I think the easiest thing to do is to, you know, if you see a tweet and it makes you angry, don't immediately retweet it, kind of dig a little bit further, separate yourself from it, and then kind of figure out, hey, I need to see what the full story is before I actually go and perhaps make some sort of, or form an opinion on it myself, and then go and propagate that opinion on social media.
Yeah, whatever happened to don't send an email when you're angry, you know? And now we've just
Yeah, don't send a tweet when
as
you're
soon as I
angry.
get angry, send out a tweet, you know? Like,
Yeah.
that maybe millions and millions of people will see. Like, where did that come from? You know, it's a big change in pace.
Yeah, I can't even count the, you know, amount of times that I've heard, like, somebody's like, oh, I tweeted something and then it went viral, and then it's like, oh my God, what did I do? Like, I had 50 followers and now a social pariah and whatnot now. It's like, whatever you do, whatever actions you take in the day and age where everybody has equal access to information, or maybe not necessarily equal, but at least everybody in the United States with the Wi-Fi connection does, you are going to be held accountable for absolutely everything you say, for better or for worse. Because I've said a lot of stupid stuff, like 100%. I can't imagine if future employers took the stupid stuff that I said when I was 18 years old into account. Thank God, you know, Twitter, you know, wasn't a big thing when I was 18, so all of my opinions aren't like categorized and quantified and cataloged where somebody can go and like riff through them or whatever. But it's like, we've got a responsibility as adults not to tweet things or distribute things that are, you know, going to be, you know, induce that sort of response. But we've also got to, you know, teach our children and the, you know, the younger generation that everything you do has consequences. And I mean, that's, like I said, for better or for worse. But yeah, I don't know. So we've just got these varying degrees of accountability in society, like predating this current paradigm. Like, we would have had varying degrees of, what's acceptable and everything like that, but it would be, kept between a group of a few people, where now everything that you say is going to be distributed to, an unlimited amount of people. Scary, kind of, to think about.
Yeah, having access to the internet is a wonderful thing, right? We've talked about this before. You have access to all of this information and all of these new social networks that you can reach people that you never could even imagine of reaching before in the past. And it's wonderful. There's so many wonderful positives to it. But then there's this darker side. And one of those things is outrage culture. And then the propagation of misinformation, conspiracy theories, and all of that as well. But yeah, definitely the outrage culture, I think, is something that people really, really need to look at hard as a society and ask ourselves what it is that we're doing, and that it's okay to have a formed position of outrage, but engaging in actual outrage culture of where you just get kind of whipped up and then you're making decisions on the fly about spreading information just because it makes you feel good in the moment. Like that's just, that is a detriment to society, in my opinion. We're doing
Yeah, I think it speaks to the value of
disservice.
I think it speaks to the value of thinking critically, and it might be a good, note to tie it together on. But yeah, I think it just speaks to the value of like we're taught how to do certain things like math or science, but we're not taught how to do things in today's age, like how to consume media consciously. Right. And like I don't think we realize the impact that the media has on us and the way we consume it. If we're really mindless about the way we consume it, then it's going to unconsciously have a big impact on us. But if we can learn how to be critical and about the way we approach information in general, and even beyond that, we just talked about a really fundamental thing about not just being less reactive. If you're in a situation with someone else and you're getting heated and you're getting angry, like obviously the better it's indisputable in that moment, the better thing to do is to try and take a step back and breathe and then approach the situation again. That should be your response not just when you're with someone else and you have that emotion, because that it's not about the other person. It's about the emotional reactions happening inside you in that moment. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be from a tweet, it can be from a headline, it can be from anything. And then if you're just gonna regurgitate that toxicity out into the world with your little megaphone on Twitter or whatever, then what are you doing? Like what are you doing for yourself? And then what are you doing for other people? It's like misery loves company. Like that's really all that gets at. And so, yeah, I think people should just learn to be more conscious and mindful about the way they approach information. They should be conscious about how they approach it, and when, and not just let it get the better of them, because it can and it does and it will if we don't do better. That's all.
We can never control what others are going to put out there, what others are going to say, what others are going to do, or what are they going to think. But we can always control how we're going to react and what we distribute and what we believe. So that's what we need to focus on. We need to focus on being better digesters of information, better at coming to conclusions, and ultimately just better people, better listeners. And I think that is it's a good point to sort of tie it all together, like you guys have been saying.
Cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's probably a good spot to stop. Unless Garrett, did you have anything that you wanted to add at the end? Otherwise, I'll just go ahead. Yeah, everything sounds good. Everything sounds good. All right, wonderful. Anyway, for all of those of you that have tuned in to listen and to watch, thank you so much. Stay tuned for more great content in the future. We certainly appreciate you, and take care, everyone.